Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of our speaker series, Reimagining the University, sponsored by the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University, and the Center on Modernity and Transition. I'm Shahrzad Sabet. I'm a fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU and co-director of the Center on Modernity and Transition.
And I'm Benjamin Schewel. Together with Shahrzad, I direct Comet. This series brings together leading thinkers to explore the historical foundations, contemporary patterns, and possible transformations of the modern research university. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Malachi Hacohen and Samuel Moyn to discuss reimagining the university in times of war.
Malachi Hacohen is professor of history at Duke University and director of the Religions and Public Life Initiative at the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke. He is the author of Karl Popper, The Formative Years in 1902 to 1945, and Jacob and Esau, Jewish European History Between Nation and Empire. Samuel Moyn is Chancellor Kent Professor of Law and History at Yale University. His books include The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, Humane, How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War, and the forthcoming book, Liberalism Against Itself, Cold War Intellectuals and the Making of Our Times. Malachi and Sam were also the speakers in our very first event of this kind in 2020. That was an absolutely terrific conversation, and we really couldn't be more delighted to have you both back together. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
So we like to start these events on a more personal and biographical note. So we were hoping in this session to ask you each to tell us a little about the personal and intellectual experiences that led you to decide on a career as an academic. We'd also be very interested to hear a few words about how your subsequent time in the academy has shaped your thinking about the current state, the opportunities, the challenges of modern research universities. So Malachi, perhaps we can begin with you.
So I was educated in Israel in the public national religious system, which reflects a synthesis of modern orthodoxy and nationalism. So in high school, to compete with the high school yeshivas, which are traditional Jewish Torah studies institutions, my high school opened the unique yeshiva path, high dose of Talmud and Jewish studies. I was enthusiastic about Talmud study and admiring of the rabbis who were my instructor. Truly, I have never experienced again in academic institution the scholarly dedication that I witnessed and experienced in high school. But it was also confining. I was dreaming of studying history, political thought, and literature with the same dedication, but with freedom from religious and nationalist strictures. So the university has become for me a lifelong refuge for liberal studies. And at the university, I chose for my undergraduate studies general history as opposed to Jewish history, and political studies as major and minor. Now, people joke about Israeli universities, suggesting that they are the last classical German universities in the world, with the traditional divisions among departments or institutes, each with their own library, advancing comprehensive study of the discipline, in my case, with a focus on European history, and a fair amount of specialization. My alma mater, Bar-Ilan University, was still ensconced in religious nationalism, and I wanted badly out of it, looking to Western universities, especially in the US and in the UK, as representing the ivory towers to which I was dreaming of gaining admission. I came to Columbia to do my graduate work in the 1980s, and the Cold War liberals, many of them of Jewish origin, captured my interest and seemed to channel my own rejection of nationalism and orthodoxy, but also of current neo-Marxist trends. I did not come to Columbia to substitute one dogma for another, but to acquire distance, epistemic humility, and have a long-term view of society and culture, one caring for and anxious about the fragility of liberal democracy. I taught at Columbia in the liberal arts core curriculum, as I think Sam also did, and participated in efforts to restructure it and to reflect class and gender concerns. Then in the early 1990s, I taught for 4 years at Reed College, which had a truly fabulous core humanities program with professors dedicated to teaching and students, all of the students thinking of themselves as intellectuals and academics in the making. I moved on to Duke University, where I have been for almost 3 decades. The professors are research-oriented. The students are professionally oriented. But until the last 15 years, we prided ourselves on our critical humanities. I've experienced the humanities going through a crisis where we are today. Meanwhile, my international collaborations made me familiar with Central European, especially Austrian universities, and the phenomenon of parallel institutions, independent government and private institutions existing on the side of the university, sometimes in producing fabulous scholarship. So while sustained reflection on the crisis and the future of the research university has never been my focal concern, there are other crises that leave me sleepless. In hindsight, I've experienced the modern university in its very diverse manifestations, and I'm happy to talk about it in the historical context of the interwar and post-war years.
Thanks very much, Malachi. So Sam, how about from your perspective, can you share a bit of how you decided to follow a career in academia and how your subsequent time in the academy has shaped your thought about the modern research university?
Well, to begin with, thanks again for having me. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and I actually went to university there, to Washington University. And for a long time, I was able to say I lived half my life in St. Louis, but alas, I'm older, much older than 44 now, so I've stopped saying it. My mother was a school teacher, elementary school teacher, and my father was an aircraft mechanic and later an executive and kind of selling companies aircraft repairs. And so it was, I think, quite something to experience the university, since my mother had attended a teacher's college in St. Louis, and my father had not graduated from high school, let alone from a university. And so it probably was in those years of being an undergraduate that I really decided that I could become an academic and that I wanted to. I should add that I grew up in close vicinity to Washington University. And so in the public schools of my town, I met friends whose parents were academics. And I think that had a kind of pushed me in the direction of academia in a sense before I really realized what it was. But it's certainly true that once I got to my undergraduate college and began taking classes, what had been kind of very confused and inchoate plans about my future really did change, because I admired, really as a kind of liberation from the constraints of my family and town, the kind of cosmopolitanism and culture that my teachers represented to me. Now I look back and I can have second thoughts about this, perception, which is, I think, very common for in the history of intellectuals and those who become intellectuals. I think looking back, I developed a way of looking down at my familial origins that I've since long since really given up. Once I finished college, I left St. Louis and planned never to go back. But I actually love going back, and my sense of the response of my fellow, seaboard elites in this country to the recent populist uprising has also reminded me of a kind of mistake I made early in life, of disdaining my origins and more ordinary people. And so I'll just say that, while I'm very happy to have become an academic, I also feel that the experience of the research university I've taken a second look at it, because I think universities are excessively alienated, and alienate those who are part of them from the from the politics and broader political culture of the places in which these universities are situated. Of course, those early years, I feel I was blinkered in some other ways, because without really thinking much about it, I realize now that my teachers were all male, all white, with very few exceptions. And they taught some things rather than others. But what they taught was still and remains in my memory enormously liberating for me. And I've never really given up working on the kinds of things and in the kinds of ways they taught me. Now, I think contrary to Malachi, while my teachers were all liberals politically, all Cold War liberals, in their basic way of looking at the world, they most of them had been strongly marked by their teachers, or the teachers of their teachers who had immigrated from Europe in the 1930s. And really, as a result of the breadth of traditions in European thought that they then taught me, I was exposed to critiques of liberalism, that these teachers of mine, though they may have been personally liberal, were very interested in teaching and propagating and forcing us to take seriously. And that very much included Marxist traditions, and also traditions of European theory between modernism and postmodernism. And my own field in which I train, European intellectual history, was really intensely concerned with a lot of non-liberal or materials that were really absolutely central to my early learning and formation. Now, later in my career, since I want to answer the second part of the question, after teaching first as a teaching assistant at the University of California, Berkeley, where I did my doctorate, and then, as Malachi mentioned, as an assistant and associate professor at Columbia University, including in the Great Books program, I made a very fateful choice to migrate into legal academia. And this changed completely my understanding of the contemporary research university. History, though classified in various ways at different places around our country, is basically part of the humanities, and the kinds of things in which I was interested in, art, literature, thought, we thought of ourselves as involved in a kind of interdisciplinary humanistic enterprise, concerns with texts and traditions. And then I understood in going to law school, but really in becoming a law teacher, just how hegemonic the social sciences have become on a certain model in the contemporary research university in this country. There's a kind of, koine, the kind of notion of a common tongue in law schools that reflects the hegemony of economics, on which many of the social sciences, so-called, have now remodeled themselves. And I feel very alienated from this in law schools, kind of the constant talk of making causal claims or normative claims as if these are the basic two options, and really thinking about human beings as irrational actors at best with small foibles, either from a kind of, psyche that's enduring in humanity, but basically a kind of seat of rationality with some small exceptions, or because of culture. And while alienating for me, it has come home to me very powerfully just how powerful this set of assumptions is outside the humanities across a lot of different fields. And I believe that it's had a lot of implications for kind of intellectual life in our time. And indeed, I would like to think about what implications the hegemony of these kinds of approaches have for the future of the research university as we continue talking.
So interesting. I'm sure we'll come back to those themes, and thank you both for those more personal introductions. As the name of this series suggests, we're beginning from the premise that the modern university needs to be reimagined. And in fact, we're inviting the speakers in this series to engage in some of that reimagination together. So let's start at the level of diagnosis. First, do you accept this premise? Does the modern university require reimagination? If so, what are the most notable crises or dysfunctions of the modern research university from your perspective? And on the other hand, what are some of the features of the modern university that you think it would be most important to preserve? Sam, let's begin with you.
Well, it's a difficult question, but I think I would begin with some preservation. I do think of the way that since the 19th century, natural sciences have occupied an extraordinary place in the history of universities and in their organization and funding as something to preserve. I don't think anyone today disagrees with that, because just the transformations that university-based research have made in the way we live strikes everyone as so indubitable. I also, though I think we should talk about the crisis in audience of humanities, think that we should preserve and actually extend the humanistic ways that some of us have been trying to, in a somewhat embattled way, honestly, preserve in our time. There's just considerable doubt about whether that preservation is going to be feasible for reasons we should get into. But I would put up a defense of the humanities as absolutely essential in some future version of a research university. Then there are elements of the research university that I think I deserve some challenge, and there are a lot. So I'll just list them briefly, and then we can come back to any of these elements. First, I think there's the hegemony of economics and certain forms of empirical social science that I think have become exclusionary, and not just because they've won in their own domains, but because they've really defined what credible inquiry ought to look like across many domains. And I've mentioned that kind of this powerfully struck me in my own evolution, so I won't dwell on it, but it does seem that we need to give that way of thinking and knowing a second look, not because it shouldn't exist and have a place, but because it's become hegemonic in our time. Then I think I'd turn to our failures with disciplinarity and the difficulty, in spite of all the talk about it, that there's been to establish non-disciplinary forms of collaboration And I think this is just an inherently difficult thing to achieve, but I would say that in my career, which is a couple decades old by now, there's just been so much effort put into talking about transcending disciplines without a lot of success in institutionally achieving interdisciplinary engagement, preserving what's good about disciplines while forcing people to transcend the ruts that they're often in. Then I think I'll end with, just something very obvious, which is that the research universities don't reflect the equal claims of women as participants in our society, and the increasing diversification in all sorts of ways of our societies, if we're interested in the United States or the transatlantic space. And this is, a cause that has troubled some people who have taken a white male professoriate as a default, but we're clearly only in the very earliest days of diversifying the faculty, but beyond that, the concerns. I'll just mention that in my, study as an undergraduate and even a graduate student of 20th century European history, the event called decolonization was never mentioned. And our exile of many places in the world, in many fields, to kind of area studies is really not adequate to a kind of the world in which we're living. And so, we'll talk more about so-called Cold War liberalism as in a way a last phase of a kind of European tradition, but it clearly didn't do well in facing a kind of, a genuinely global era in which lots of different kinds of peoples have legitimate claims to attention and study. And we haven't either, I think, in spite of some, remarkable progress. There's still a long way to go to make our universities less parochial in their concerns than they have been in the last couple of centuries.
Thank you. Malachi?
So let me first, like Sam, but perhaps in a somewhat different way, query the premise that the modern research, the modern university needs to be reimagined. I think there's a measure of self-aggrandizement and of lack of historicity in current discussions of the crisis. In its familiar US form, the modern research university has existed less than a century. It represents the influence of the German research university, which antedated it by half a century. But the university had emerged from medieval Europe, and there had been modern universities before the so-called modern research universities, and many alternative educational institutions. Our discussions tend to focus on current private and public US universities, and we extend them rather offhandedly and globally, and marginalize liberal arts colleges and other academic institutions. So I wonder whether the modern research university exists as an ideal type, and we should recognize that in the history of the university, not to mention of academic institutions in general, the US research university is rather recent and limited. That said, I would be deeply sorry to see some of its vital components gone. Reimagining the university, however, is an unappealing term, unattractive term to me, in as much as it suggests that the university represents a failure of imagination, whereas I consider the forces undermining it to be lacking in imagination. Reimagining is also a favorite term of administrators when they empty the university of its ideals and coordinate it with the market. What we need to reimagine is our roles as educators in forging and sustaining humanity and culture in an increasingly liberal technocratic society that allows the market to shape its education and is hostile to scholarship and the liberal arts. As to diagnosis, I agree with Michael Sandel, who in The Tyranny of Merit showed how credentialism, or the role of the university in providing credentials, enabling socioeconomic advance, has diminished its investment in scholarship and undermined the liberal arts by making education increasingly pre-professional. The tighter the connection between credentials and professional success, the greater the urge to cut out anything irrelevant to the credentials. The ideas of individual self-development, of experimentation, of exploration, of intellectual and artistic pleasure, they become incomprehensible, a waste of time. University curricula are instrumentalized. Liberal arts education is emptied of its original meaning. Scholarship is increasingly instrumentalized. We speak of professors as producers of knowledge, and administrators push professors even further to make scholarship even more practical, so that they could see immediate return. The space, freedom, and distance that were allowed to the scholar before, with a wager that in the long run, those will produce a greater return, greater advances in knowledge, greater insights into the possibilities of humanity and culture, and that such advances are best accomplished through the exploration of otherness, of past civilizations and foreign culture. These space, freedom, and distance get progressively diminished, and quickly so. This also answers the question of what's worth keeping. As your commentators in the first session of this series pointed out, credentialism has been there even before the modern research university, and it's here to stay. And so will the university. The question is whether we shall be able to sustain the scholar and liberal arts education. I'm not sure, and I'm deeply concerned. There were the reasons I joined the university, and it would be a shame to lose them.
Well, thank you both for extremely interesting answers to that first question. So now we can turn to a topic about which you've both written, which is German efforts to remold established patterns of academic thought, intellectual inquiry in the aftermath of the First World War. So two movements that readily come to mind are the Vienna Circle, out of which logical positivism arose, the Frankfurt School, and also the Frankfurt School of Social Criticism, which has come to be associated with thinkers like Lukács, Horkheimer, Adorno, and more recently, Jürgen Habermas. Around the same time, however, one also observes a powerful neo-traditionalist movement, one might say, with figures like Martin Buber, Franz Rosenzweig, and Karl Barth standing out with clarity and force in this sort of tertiary movement. So for a student of intellectual history, it shouldn't be hard to appreciate some of the differences that arise between these German interwar movements of intellectual reform. But it can be somewhat more difficult to discern the commonalities, the interconnections that bind these movements together as facets of a broader or common cultural or intellectual shift. So in this regard, Sam and Malachi, we'd like to pose to you the following question. What were some of the common problems and conditions, both within the university and in society at large, that the intellectuals associated with these movements, the Vienna Circle, the Frankfurt School, neo-traditionalist movements, sought to address? And in what ways have these interwar intellectual movements subsequently shaped the contemporary academy and in particular, academic debates within the humanities. So Malachi, we can start with you.
Okay, thanks. So it's interesting that you pose the question of the commonality of these widely divergent thinkers and intellectual trends, and that you pose it with respect to the social problem and the university, and this may produce some new insight. So let us begin with the social problems. I mean, the failure of the socialist revolution in Central and Eastern Europe and its success in the Soviet Union were the background against which the Frankfurt School formed its Marxist-inspired critical theory. And incidentally, Lukács informed the work, but he was never a member. The Frankfurt School used highly sophisticated rendition of Marxist theory, elaborated in the context of the German philosophical tradition, to analyze the cultural consequences of life under capitalism, explain the rise of fascism, and retain a vision of human liberation, however remote. With Habermas, the confrontation with the German past and the social possibilities of free communication and rationality in advanced capitalist societies became center, and now it was also in conversation with Anglo-Saxon philosophical traditions. For the Vienna Circle and the logical positivists, the bankruptcy of traditional philosophy, accentuated by the cultural crisis of World War I and what appeared to be as the triumph of science and technology and their potential to improve human life, gave the impetus to an effort for a radical reform of language that would purge, at least in philosophy and the sciences, anything metaphysical and non-empirical. So like the Frankfurt School, they wish to reform philosophy and contribute to social progress, but they affirm the logic and language of the natural sciences in ways that the Frankfurt School felt could diminish the possibilities of social change. There were critics from around the circle. Karl Popper, the subject of my first book, thought that both the linguistic focus and the crusade against metaphysics were misguided, and offered his critical rationalism and the liberal open society as an alternative. And finally, the religious critics were around, and they criticized 19th century liberal theology, Protestant and Jewish alike, as compromising the authenticity of religious experience and depriving humanity that now was at the mercy of heartless science and technology, of genuine community with man and God alike. In response to the catastrophe of World War I, which they took to be the result of 19th century progressive triumphalism, they reaffirmed the centrality of revelation in Rosenzweig, of human sinfulness in Barth, of mystical experience in Buber. So the three groups that I've just mentioned all responded to the crisis that were emerging from World War I. Now, it is interesting that Habermas, the single thinker among those whom you have mentioned, whose career overlapped with the post-war years, is also the single one whose career was completely academic, right? That is following the usual course of a university professor. Most of the others were professors in the post, were professors at some point in the post-war years, right? In Germany, in Hungary, and in Israel. But of those whom I have mentioned, Barth was the only university professor before World War II in Bonn, before he was dismissed by the Nazis in 1935. Buber was appointed in 1938 as a sociology professor in Jerusalem. All the others were affiliated with a range of private institutes like the Institut für Sozialforschung or the Rosenzweig, the Freie Jüdische Lehrhaus, or the informal Vienna Circle. They could not make it into the academy because of limited academic resources, academic conservatism and nationalism. Most of them were socialist, or anti-Semitism. Most of them were Jews. So they made a living through a variety of odd jobs, some academically related jobs like librarians. Often one member had an academic position like Moritz Schlick in Vienna, and the others did not. So the circle and those other institutes existed on the margins of the university, intense relationship with it. And finally, the majority of the thinkers you mentioned went into exile during World War II or migrated permanently. But the international connections that they establish spread the influence of the movements globally, and helped also the Frankfurt School members who went back to Germany. So I think there are several lessons for us here. The first one is that the research university was not the center of intellectual innovation, at least until the post-war years. I think this will hold for the US as well as for interwar Germany. Second, that all throughout, a range of private and public institutions on the margins of the university and in competitive relationship with it have been the source of intellectual innovation. Third, that the university has been progressively internationalized, and intellectual innovation often came from the outside. The Great World War II migration was a major source for US research university innovation. And finally, the Jewish role in both intellectual innovation and in entry into the academy reveals the danger of the nationalization of the university, which often worked against minorities. And it reveals also the working and the blessings of internationalization.
Thank you so much, Malachi. Sam.
Well, it was such a beautiful answer, which anticipated much of what I was going to say and went far beyond it, that I'll just repeat a couple of things that Malachi said, and then, add a bit, thinking from the perspective of the impact of these figures and our present situation. I think I would moderate Malachi's answer just in one way. It does seem very important that practically all of these figures really were born out of their experiences in the German or Austro-German university. Sometimes they were in revolt against it, but much of what they did is unthinkable, but for the excellence within, constraints and limits of the university culture that forged them. And then if there had been less anti-Semitism and more adventurous faculty in the interwar period, who knows, many of these figures may not have been forced to the margins or into other institutions or to other countries, as most of them were. Remember, even Walter Benjamin, who has become iconic in the 1980s and 90s, dutifully attempted to gain an academic position and famously had his Habilitationsschrift refused on the origins of German tragic drama. And many of the others, most of the others, gained PhDs or even the second PhD that Benjamin failed to do. So their trajectories were cut off. I think it's essential, as Malachi's pointed out, that they were were partly out of choice, partly out of generosity of their parents, who were often wealthy, or of others funding them, as in the case of the Frankfurt School. Many of these figures were able to have a more public role, or at least an educational role alongside the university. Franz Rosenzweig taught at a kind of public Jewish educational institution. I think you could include Habermas in that story, in spite of Malachi's accurate observation about his generally, professionalizing trajectory, because post-war West Germany did create interstitial spaces that America has not, and for a very crucial period in his trajectory, Habermas was in residence at Starnberg in a kind of interdisciplinary institute, and his thought kind of was transformed in dialogue with psychology and other fields as a result of that period. And I completely agree with Malachi that though the reasons for the marginality of these figures to universities, at least in the interwar period, kind of may be different, but they remind us of the importance and value of intellectual activity that takes place outside university walls. Now, we know that to an extent because the crisis in the humanities, so-called, has led a whole generation of humanists outside the university walls of our country by necessity. And there are institutions like there's a Brooklyn Institute, which have been created, and at which many doctoral students or humanists with doctorates who cannot find more secure positions end up teaching at. But I think they're underfunded, and they're not kind of distributed very well within the country. And so I think there's a lesson there to take about how there could be not just the renovation of universities, but the pluralization of sites of education and thinking outside universities. The last thing I'll say is that in my sense, many of these figures were really canonized after their deaths and made obligatory reading and central to the renovation of lots of fields by the kinds of people like the teachers I had, who were students of emigres, who were intensely interested in the later Cold War, in alternative ways of thinking as a result often of experiences they'd had in the 1960s in the United States or Europe, and the rise of kind of countercultural elements and critical perspectives. And they revived a lot of interwar thought and made it central to the humanities in ways that have really defined it in our time. And there's a lesson there too, obviously, that you can fail, you can be cast from the university, you can occupy relatively obscure parallel spaces in your own lifetime and end up impacting future research universities profoundly. And as we think about the changing of fashions, sometimes, changing of fashions that's, appropriate and necessary, there's no reason not to believe that foreclosed alternatives or missed authorities could serve future universities and become central to them as orthodoxies change.
Yeah. Sam and Malachi, you've both also written extensively about post-war and Cold War liberalism, and in particular about the limitations of liberal thought in the decades since World War II. So I'd like to ask you first to tell us about the trajectory of liberalism as you see it over the course of those decades. In other words, what have been the most notable aspects of liberal thought since the end of the Second World War? And second, in what ways has that trajectory of liberalism since the mid-20th century, or excuse me, since the mid-20th century, influenced and shaped the modern university as we know it today? Sam?
Well, this is an extraordinary question, which would require, more time than we have to answer fully. So I'm just going to mention a few points very selectively, and then, look forward to Malachi's perspective on this. So I think the liberalism of the Cold War, or of World War II and the Cold War, really had an extraordinary effect on the American and to an extent transatlantic university in giving it new tasks and funding. And the Cold War ended up being the kind of glory years, especially from the perspective of government funding for many elements of the university. And we kind of keenly appreciate the loss of that funding if we're not in the natural sciences, where there are government bodies still providing a lot of money, grants and so forth. And it's not as if we want to retrieve the Cold War competition that may have been at the root of that government largesse, although it seems as if a new Cold War with China is coming. But we should remember just how much wealth there was that was widely enough distributed in universities across the country, especially at state universities, neither Malachi nor I teach at them, and which have really experienced kind of collapsing or free falling government assistance from their own states and the federal government in our time, in case there's some way of restoring that funding, because you can't imagine the achievements of the Cold War university without it. I'd add another, let's say, economic dimension, which is that the early Cold War, at least, and the glory years of the production of academics and teachers, including in the humanities in the 1960s, really presupposed an extraordinary amount of private wealth in those decades from roughly the 1940s through the 1970s of growth, whereas ours, as Malachi said indirectly earlier, is a neoliberal era. And it's parents and their children in universities, because of the decline in growth since the 1970s, and especially concerns that have taken root since the 2008 financial crisis, are just much more concerned with the instrumental value of education than was, I think, common in the Cold War, ironically. But I think because the amount of wealth and the distribution of wealth made it possible for a lot of people to embrace the humanities, both parents and teachers, in ways that are rarer now because of a sense of decline and a kind of zero-sum game in society about who will win and who will lose. And so I'm just stressing these facts because they seem utterly essential. But I do want to also talk about Cold War liberalism and its content, because I think it's an interesting set of ideas that deserve some attention here. And I'll just point out a couple of aspects of Cold War liberalism that may have been credible in its time, but maybe have proven, I think, troubling in retrospect. One is that, the classic Cold War liberal theorists like Isaiah Berlin, Karl Popper, we're in fact living in the era of the greatest expansion of liberal states and the most extraordinary amounts of redistributive policy that liberals have ever undertaken compared to the 19th century and compared to our own time. But their theories are libertarian. They don't register this extraordinary transformation in liberal states. Their concerns, understandably, perhaps given the antagonist in the Cold War and sometimes the life experience of Cold War liberals, were really about what happens when states become too large or invasive, or when they trample freedom, not when their expansion and wealth and generosity makes freedom credible. And we do have to think about how it happened that we lost the kind of mid-20th century state, the early Cold War state that did create a kind of extraordinary setting for all its limitations of a transatlantic research university, lots of new universities, for that matter, especially in Western Europe, or old ones kind of reinvented and took on, new guises. All right, so then there's the second element of Cold War liberalism, I guess I'd invoke and worry about in its content. I agree completely with Malachi that the humanities in particular depend upon a sense that there are higher and lower pursuits, and that aesthetic beauty matters, and that self-creation and self-development ought to be central to our lives, and therefore ought to be central to what universities instruct young people in trying to achieve. And yet, if you look at at least some Cold War liberal theorists, there seems to be a rejection of theories that are about self-creation, self-development, individually and collectively. A classic example would be Berlin's essay on the two kinds of liberty, where it's basically implied that the so-called positive liberty of the continental European tradition can become a recipe for tyranny and the destruction of freedom. So this is another paradox, that Cold War liberal theory is arising in a setting of kind of this extraordinary expansion of universities and really the acme of interest in the humanities in particular. But it's not clear that the political philosophy of Cold War liberalism really adequately captures that commitment.
Malachi, same simple question to you. Tell us about the trajectory of liberalism.
This was a wonderful answer, and my response nicely, I think, complements Sam's. I mean, if we had time, and only if we had time, I would engage Sam a bit both about the subject of the state and of the self-realization of the self as issues in Cold War liberal thought. I think we see it a bit differently, and I think I'm less critical in my judgment, of the liberals in this regard. But these are nuances, and I think that for the purposes of our discussion focusing on the university, I think our views complement each other very, very nicely. Even if we see the history of liberalism, I mean, somewhat differently. So, look, I mean, definitions of liberalism are religion because endeavors to capture liberalism with a coherent set of core principles or core values, they're bound to fail. You either expand the camp of the liberals so much that the concept is no longer meaningful, or you exclude many who call themselves liberal. So I suggest that when we think about the history of liberalism, we best view liberalism as a series of historical dilemmas, in which volatile management of democracy and nationalism and an inability to commit to either or deny either. The minute you commit or deny either, you're no longer a liberal. These are liberalism's historical trademarks. And the Cold War liberalism, to me, represented a generation that was formed in the struggle against National Socialism and Stalinism. They were determined to halt the slide toward totalitarianism, and they advocated what Judith Shklar called liberalism of fear, anti-utopian, anti-communist, and supportive of liberal democracy and of the welfare state. I do not think that Sam will disagree here. He just thinks that this is not what they focused on. They were decidedly secular intelligentsia, and they decried communism as a political religion. And they confronted a series of traditional liberal dilemmas that related to the management of democracy and nationalism. And these dilemmas define best their place in the history of liberalism. Unlike some of their 19th century predecessors, the Cold War liberals could not imagine withdrawing universal suffrage or denying national self-determination. But the anti-Semitic mobs, the totalitarian parties' electoral success, and the murderous ethno-national conflicts that they had experienced in Central and Eastern Europe filled them with terror. They blessed their luck for living in the post-World War II world in orderly polities where government enjoyed public support and ethnic conflicts had been settled, but they could think of few effective remedies should lawfulness be disrupted or ethnic stripe develop. Their pragmatic politics and piecemeal reforms were ineffective in managing crisis. They acknowledged as much by consigning international relations to realpolitik that was exempted from constitutional constraints. They lived on edge between commitment and betrayal of liberal values, always negotiating conflicting ends. I hasten to add that I do not know a better way of living. Such is life in the open society, a constant trade-off of conflicting goods and arbitration of dilemmas, often on the edge of an abyss. Now, my scholarship highlighted the Jewish profile of Cold War liberalism. The transatlantic intellectual networks at its core represented the collaboration between emigres from Nazi Europe, remigres to post-war Europe, and the New York intellectuals. All three groups were heavily Jewish. They included famous figures like Raymond Aron, Daniel Bell, Sam mentioned Isaiah Berlin and Karl Popper, but there was also Sidney Hook in the United States, Manes Sperber in France. And unlike their 19th century forebears, the Cold War Jewish liberals, they were public intellectuals more than political leaders. Most were active in the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was a major international anti-communist organization with its headquarters in Paris. It was clandestinely supported by the CIA. And the Congress for Cultural Freedom coordinated a global network of sophisticated political cultural magazines and an international seminars and conference program. So Cold War liberalism signaled the advent of post-war transatlantic culture. Now, both internationalization and the Jewish role were crucial to the transformation of the US Research University. Cold War liberalism signaled the entry of the Jews en force into the US Academy. All pre-war barriers to Jewish appointments in the humanities and social sciences collapsed in the 1950s. Many New York intellectuals became leading academic figures and, at the same time, public intellectuals. They provided models of the engaged intellectuals and have whet the appetite of university administrators for what has become known in current academic parlance as public-facing scholarship. Yet, they were the very people who were on guard for academic freedom and scholarly integrity. And in the age of Jewish-Black Civil Rights Alliance, they sought to open the academy to other groups that were excluded by the Anglo-Saxon establishment. They represented the convergence of liberalism, scholarship, and liberal arts education. Until the 1970s, they rarely spoke of their own Jewishness, but immersion in the liberal arts represented also their quest as Jews for cultural integration in American society. And I showed in my work how problematic their Jewishness has remained, but this is not a place to elaborate on it. Bottom line, okay? Cold War liberalism represented the opening of the US Academy to Jews, vindication of liberal arts educations and scholarly ideal, internationalization of the US university via transatlantic culture and intellectual migration in the wake of National Socialism, as Sam so effectively described, a high point to the US, or for the US research university.
Well, so, as we've touched on several times, one of the major features of the 20th century has been the decline of avowed imperial states and the proliferation of nation states. Within these global processes of nation building, the act of establishing a modern research university has often played an important role. For example, one might think of how the founding of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem was presented to the League of Nations as crucial evidence of the viability of the Zionist project, or how also in 1950, just as the United Nations was deciding whether or not Eritrea should be federated with Ethiopia, Haile Selassie announced the establishment of the University of Addis Ababa in partnership with the universities of Oxford and London. So during the same time, however, we also observed universities providing a context within which intellectuals could begin to identify how nation-building processes have harmed minorities, and also to begin imagining new post-national world orders. So the common thread that runs through both of these tendencies is the fact that modern research universities are not only sites for the scientific objective examination of reality, they are also themselves helping to produce and reproduce distinctive social realities. So this brings us to a question. What kind of social reality are modern research universities currently helping to produce? And how might the university at the same time provide a context within which we can begin to imagine and create new social forms that move beyond some of the characteristics of contemporary social and political order? So Malachi, we can start with you.
Thank you. Yeah, Ben, it's interesting that the question of the social reality reproduced by universities comes following our discussion of Cold War liberalism, because as Sam intimated, it was the protest against Vietnam in 1968 that highlighted the university's complicity and collaboration with the US defense establishment, which is a permanent dilemma, right, to the research university. And interestingly enough, that sort of collusion included both state universities and private universities, which are presumably not as beholden to the state. And this exposed academic investment in the political order and vulnerability to political and social pressures. Research has to be funded, and universities seek financial growth. How one guards academic integrity is a permanent dilemma, and not one easily solved. Now, whether within the imperial order or in a national context, the modern research university in Germany and commonly elsewhere was a branch of the state. I'll be a professor of Leipzig in a few weeks. I signed in as a German civil servant. Right? British universities educated and credentialized generations of colonial officials. So the transition from empire to nation state, if it ever occurred in the way you described, did not necessarily entail a radical transformation of the state-university relations. But it is true that universities were active agents in the formation of national culture. And as you suggested, they became a mark of a nation coming into its own and being recognized and respected by others. Ominously, professors and students were often the avant-garde of integral nationalism. In Central and Eastern Europe, professors and students led anti-Semitic movements and disproportionately supported fascism. Numerous clauses that limited Jewish access to education became a standard in the interwar years across both sides of the Atlantic. In both cases, it reflected a more wide-reaching effort to maintain the racial and ethnic hegemony of the majority. But you're also right that nowadays, the movements for reckoning with history and the racial past are often led from within the academy. And the pursuit of diversity and multiculturalism reflects these efforts and provides rubrics for the imagined ideal university. But paradoxically, the convergence of credentialism and progressive politics produced a polarizing politics that threatens not only the university, but the constitutional order. And here, I think Sam and Michael Sandel's may see things in a similar fashion, because Sandel explains to me in an effective fashion the utter failure of progressive Americans to communicate with Trump supporters, with the non-college educated workers and farmers. We recognize them as the unfortunate losers of capitalist globalization and think that they turned against liberal values and adopted racist and anti-immigrant attitudes because they were losing racial privilege and social and economic standing. And we are not wrong, but we miss the most crucial. We are witnessing the failure of the American ethos that you can pull yourself ahead through hard work. And if you're not successful, you're mostly yourself to blame. As the educational elite, we have contributed culturally and institutionally to sustaining this American myth by endorsing what Sandel calls the tyranny of merit, credentialism, the belief that education is crucial to advance, that it properly recognizes individual talent, that merit, which is understood as talent plus hard work, should be rewarded, and at least our own success and leadership as a progressive elite are well deserved. We are a constant reminder to the non-college educated of their failure, and yet we presume to teach them what went wrong. As we seek to remove racial barriers and increase diversity, we make it plain to the non-college educated whites that we are not their priority. They are not our priority. So we pretend that the universities are progressive agents of social mobility and make effort to even out the field of competition by engineering a racially diverse student body that could sustain the rhetoric of work hard and you will rise. Yeah, but everyone is presumably invited to compete and show us their best. But admissions in elite universities reinforce the social order. And it's outrageous to claim that those who get in are deserving on account of merit rather than socioeconomic advantage. Universities are the most crucial institution, the linchpin to sustaining an increasingly unequal social order by providing credentials and supporting the success ethics of the deserving elite. Now, realize this critical analysis focuses on the US problem. Elsewhere, in most European countries, credentialism has taken root, but has not had quite as harmful impact because access to public education and elite universities is more widely available. And this opens a window to a solution, but I shall leave that to the next question.
Sam?
So I'm going to answer the question a little bit more abstractly, although I really like what Malachi said. I mean, I take the question to be about the relation of universities and society, and especially the way in which universities can host the emergence of new ideals and transformative projects for society. And I think the way I would, think about this is to focus on the productive illusion of the independence of universities and societies. It's an illusion because, of course, as Malachi has emphasized, universities are part of their societies and reflect the ambient forces and values abroad. And there's no way to rigidly separate them as if they're ivory towers that are, distinctive from the societies in which they're located. And often, of course, we find, especially in retrospect, that university academics, including in the natural sciences, which are unfailingly also political in the way that they interpret nature, are just conformists with just the most general social beliefs and trends. And sometimes when university academics are showily reject what they take to be the orthodoxies of their time, they're never more conformist than in that gesture. I think Voltaire, this Enlightenment thinker, once said that you can give up the virtues of your time, but still share in all of its vices. And of course, in general, universities are never better than the societies that that surround them. That said, I also want to emphasize that it can be a productive illusion for those in universities to think of themselves as in a separate space, as in even a privileged space for the formulation of transformative alternatives. Now, as Malachi said, there are just very good examples which we can talk about, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, in which universities are like laboratories for early experiments in what could be done more generally outside society, or what can't be done. Just as an example, the contemporary diversification of universities has gone far further, both along gender and racial lines, if not class lines, than the attempt to diversify even other elite spaces like corporations, let alone society and sites of social power more generally. But, while we'd have to look at each of these transformative projects, I mean, it would be a very sad situation if we decided that because they're just creatures of their society, universities shouldn't be defended as spaces where big alternatives can be formulated. And I don't know about Malachi, but my ideal of the intellectual is that of the gadfly, the critic who indicts the direction of his or her society and presents alternatives. Now, of course, unfailingly, we'll see that none of these figures is operating in a void. All of them are deeply dependent on ambient social forces and values. And as we discussed earlier, there ought to be lots of spaces in society, including ones parallel to the university, where thinking can occur and alternatives can be devised. But we wouldn't want to give up the university as such a space for that reason. And potentially, very extraordinary transformations are possible if they're allowed to incubate first in universities.
Well, we're slowly approaching the end of our session. So to close, and in the spirit of reimagination, we'd like to invite you to free your own imaginations and to consider what a university could be. As we discussed in our last session with Susan Peterson and Chad Wellman, many contemporary critiques of the university and of university-based knowledge in particular are not just epistemological, but they are also ethical. That is, they are about the kind of person the university produces. Given the various crises and challenges that our society currently faces, what kind of person do you believe research universities should produce? And how would the university need to be reimagined in order to produce such a person? I'll put the question perhaps a little bit more provocatively. If you were given free rein to establish a new university, or if you prefer a new institution devoted to the generation and dissemination of knowledge, what kind of an institution would you design? And in particular, what kind of person, what kind of capable agent, let's say, would you want this new institution to bring forth, given the needs of contemporary society? Sam, another easy question. We'll start with you.
It's a cinch to answer that one quickly. No, it's a wonderful question. I know we're all, if we're in universities, in a sense, thinking about it all the time, even when we don't have lots of plans or power to enact those plans. I guess I thought I'd respond by thinking about weakening the sense of apartness that many in universities feel from their larger societies. I said it was a productive illusion, but it's certainly true that those outside universities don't feel a part of them. And indeed, in our time, especially because of new kinds of political sorting, reject universities. And yet it's not just for that reason that I think we should imagine a way of opening universities. There even are things around the world called open universities to more kinds of people, but especially more kinds of activities. So, we have devised a university that's something like a finishing school, and we have lost something that I think Malachi and I are believe in, the idea of universities as kind of acculturating institutions. I would also add that universities ought to be focused as much as they ever have been, and even more, on critical citizenship to counterbalance professionalism, which has really, I think, as Malachi has pointed out several times now, conquered the sensibilities of many, both administrators and students. But I wondered if we could imagine, in part to kind of counteract the sense of opposition between universities and societies, some more inclusionary kind of university. I mean, Malachi pointed out that universities once were inclusionary for different classes. And the best example of that in the post-World War II period was the GI Bill. Now we've rectified the racialization and gendering of something like the GI Bill, which really led millions of white men into universities like never before in American history. We've rectified those exclusions in our time, but we've really given up on any kind of broadening of the university experience of the kind the GI Bill represented. I mean, more and more people go to universities, but given the hierarchy of universities in our time, it's not clear that the kinds of opportunities that are being spread in our time, especially, let's say, down the class system that we have. Just to put a kind of finer point on it, Malachi has referenced the critiques of meritocracy that are abroad, and in my way of thinking, one way of remedying those would involve, vast expansion of some of the elite institutions, or even like random selection of students on a much broader basis, to kind of counteract the intense competition that goes into getting a top spot in one of these allegedly top universities, such as the ones Malachi and I teach at. And then I imagine a kind of broadening by age. It's one of the less remarked features of the history of the research university that it's coincided with an indefinite expansion of the lifespan, really since the later 19th century to our time. And yet we haven't devised a very good way of institutionalizing perpetual education. Many of us have taught at institutions where, the formal students, undergraduates, are sometimes, in a phase of life where they haven't gotten much sleep, where they have so many other things to do. Some of them are activated by learning, but some are there for credentialing and professional reasons. And then we might have a few senior citizens who have found their way in a time of life where they love the material and invest far more heavily than many students who are formally enrolled. And I wonder if we couldn't imagine universities in a new way, as not just finishing schools for youth, but as something that connects to a kind of perpetual enlightenment and perpetual education project for those of us who, if we're lucky, are likely to live longer and longer lives, thanks precisely to many of the innovations in medicine that come out of universities themselves. So this would be a kind of utopia where universities are not for one time of life, and not for an elite, but for everyone all the time, or at least intermittently through a productive life.
Really interesting point. Malachi, how would you respond?
Well, I think we're very much in sync in thinking about this question. It's really, I'm delighted to find that this is the case. The university and society are going to be brought closer together, whether we like it or not. The question is whether it's going to be university administrators succumbing to the market who are going to do that, or whether we are going to have some of the alternatives that Sam was advancing. So, my proposals are typically reform-oriented. I do not seek to reimagine the institution. I seek to preserve scholarly space and liberal arts education, the ideal of the research university at its best, and those are under threat. What I think we need a different combination of humility and confidence than the one that academics presently have. We need humility in regard to who we are, what we know, and what we propose, but we need a renewed confidence in the cultural mission of scholarship and liberal arts education. The nexus of credentialism and merit must be weakened. It has already produced not only social and cultural polarization between the academy and non-college educated, but also a mental health crisis among undergraduates. They are unnecessarily worried about the future, even in elite institutions, and driven to the limit from day one. They have no time for liberal arts education. Credentialism threatens to displace scholarship and the liberal arts. So first, I think that admission policies should be loosened to include a larger social body and mitigate class privilege. Above a certain level of cultural competence, admission can be by lottery. This is compatible with with preference for diversity, and it will undermine the tyranny of meritocracy. Self-worth will no longer be as closely tied to admission to elite institution. Access to elite education can also be supported more generously by the state. This is already the situation in many European countries that often have an opposite problem to the United States. Leading public universities are overwhelmed by the number of students. An in-between situation is certainly attainable, although it will require overcoming an entrenched administrative culture which opts for brand competition, and of course, conservative hostility to increasing university funding. I think, and again, I'll mention Sandel, he seeks to restore the dignity of labor, non-academically credentialed labor. Paradoxically, this will increase the free space for the cultural mission of education, because it will no longer be exclusively vested in credential as key to self-worth, to recognition of merit and success. Truth is, the current madness of students driving themselves to the brink of mental collapse in search of grades has no economic rationale to it. Especially in a prosperous economy such as we have had in the last decade, they will all do splendidly. They can easily relax and have good 4 years of liberal arts education, experimentation, diverse experiences, occasional failures, and freedom to breathe without putting their future at risk. On the contrary, their expanded education is likely to produce a broader-minded and experimental worker. They just don't know that, because this is not what they have been told. To endeavor and overcome cultural polarization, projects encouraging epistemic humility and civil discourse, such as the ones presently attempted at Duke and other universities, these are welcome. The program I direct has encouraged interreligious dialogue, seeking to overcome one dimension of social polarization. Our academic elite is all too sure about its progressive politics. It needs to learn to listen. But at the same time, it should reacquire confidence in the mission of liberal scholarship and humanities education. The crisis of the humanities was not produced by cultural critics, but by the culture of credentialism and professionalism, but the vitriolic attacks on the great books curricula and on the humanities in general for their elitism and investment in Western hegemony have not helped. They left us ideologically vulnerable when global markets claim domination over the university. Reforming these curricula so they become culturally inclusive has been the right way to proceed all along. Instead, we seem to have thrown the baby with the bathwater. My hope is that if the reforms and mindset I suggested above prevail, we will also rescue scholarship from instrumentalization. In a globalized world, so immediate in its diversity, the exploration of the other, of the foreign and the distant, and the historical understanding of how we have arrived here, these are more crucial than ever. But the space, time, and resources allocated for such scholarly exploration is shrinking, not expanding. Can this be reversed? I'm trying to be hopeful, but it's hope against hope. The promise the research university had for the boy from Israel has been fulfilled, but I'm not sure that it will be available to my daughters, and certainly not to my grandchildren, should my daughters choose to have to have children. I've seen the fears of the Cold War liberals for the future of liberal democracy become real much earlier than I expected. Liberal educations I admired, the liberal educations that I admired, I've seen it being undermined. And I'm beginning also to wonder how long the unusual welcome for Jews in the academy will last. So in my worst moments, I comfort myself by remembering that culture and scholarship were not exclusively produced by universities, that courts, monasteries, and yeshivas had been intellectual centers, and that I have so many colleagues in non-university centers producing wonderful, innovative works. So there is life beyond the modern research university, even if it's a somewhat impoverished one.
Well, Malachi Hacohen, Samuel Moyn, we've reached the end of our time, but another wonderfully rich and stimulating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We'd also like, thank you. We'd also thank our sponsors again, the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University, and the Center on Modernity and Transition. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us today. We hope you'll join us again next time on Thursday, March 29th at 3 p.m. Eastern, noon Pacific, when Ben and I will have the great pleasure of welcoming Manan Ahmed, Gurminder Bambra, and Valerie Lambert to discuss post-colonial knowledge. Please note that that event will take place on Thursday and not on the usual Friday. We hope to see all of you then. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.